Since you've been sending in your writing, let's take a look at some of it. Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. By now, I should probably expect it, but I've been surprised by the number of submissions that have been coming into the show. I've got a lot of things to sift through and read, but I'm excited about the possibilities of enriching the show with examples from you, illustrating writing principles, and even just taking some time every now and then to respond to your writing directly. In fact, that's exactly what we're doing today. Since I think most of us found each other through poetry, I thought we'd start with a handful of poems that got sent in, and our job today is to read them and talk through the feedback I'd give them. You know, the things they do well and the ways they could be even better. But before we do, I thought we'd lay down just a few rules that we'll be working with going forward. One, of course, there's only so much time in a video, so we'll do a handful of poems today and more stuff in the future. This is only the first in what I hope will be a long and helpful series for all of you. Which means, second, if your submission didn't show up here today, there's always a chance it might in the future, and it may go without saying, but it's a lot more likely for submissions that fit the tone of the show. You know, you can send as many bawdy limericks as you like, but I'm probably not going to air them. 3, in videos like this, where I'm just giving feedback on your writing, I'm treating everything as a work in progress, so that we can learn together how to approach criticism of your work. So you can be sure that I will give you praise, but it would be a dereliction of my duty to give you only praise. 4, that said, everyone who submitted has put their trust in us, in me, and all of you. So while I may tolerate a certain amount of nonsense directed at me, I've authorized Kaput to wipe from the channel's memory any voices that are unkind to our submitters. Share your constructive thoughts, of course, but again, ridicule is not the name of the game here. And 5, above all, my suggestions are always non-binding. They represent the perspective of one reader reading your work. Granted, I'd like to think of myself as something approaching an expert reader, but I'm still just a reader. When I present a possible revision, I'll do my best to explain why I think that revision would be an improvement, but you know your vision for the piece, and you can decide whether my feedback helps you get there or not. Okay, so I think that's a good place to start. As we take a look at these poems, you may decide that you want similar feedback, and the link to submit your stuff to the show is right there in the description. And if you're more in the mood for something a little less public and a little more in-depth, there's also a link down there to work with me one-on-one. I've had a great time working with some of you in the last couple of weeks on your writing projects, and I'm excited to see more of the awesome things you're doing. But that's enough setup. Let's get into today's poems. Regrets, my love. I couldn't save you. I hope you may forgive me, though I had feared it may never come. The time we spent together can't be forgotten as I hold those memories dear. All the times you had laughed, I remember still as I cherish them in my heart. The ineffable image of you stays vivid in my mind. So does the gentle touch of your hand. But when you were in need of me, I had faltered. I'm sorry. At eve, I sat on a solitary stair. Your loss had weighed down upon me. Your soul came to me. Burdened by regret and grief, I sought forgiveness. It felt as if there was a glass between your hand and mine, separating us. Your soul had forgiven me. I still wept. The grief still lingers. But then the invisible glass dissolved. I touched your hand for the last time. Every story ends on the last page, but yours, alas, ended ere mine. I know you await my arrival. I just have a few more promises to fulfill. First things first, check out the clarity of the emotional tone in this poem. I think you'd have a hard time coming out of this one without a clear sense of the poem's grief, regret, and sorrow. But I also love that it turns at the end to something a little more hopeful and determined. The speaker here obviously feels this loss of a loved one deeply, but that momentary contact at the end is hopeful, and there's a compelling resolve in the final line to fulfill whatever promises still lie ahead. This poem leaves us somewhere different from where it started us out, and it's a meaningful and uplifting move. The little residence with Robert Frost's promises to keep, that's not bad either. But in addition to the major gesture of the piece, there are some great moments here and there. The glass image is a cool one, a tangible but invisible barrier. There's a tension in that, to be constrained by something that you can't see. And the way it dissolves to give us that lovely passing moment of touch. It's good stuff. And there's always more we could say, but let's talk about a couple possible priorities for revision. Number one, while the emotional tone of the poem is clear, The literal context of the poem is fairly obscure. I think we can confidently say that the speaker cares about the person they address. The title does give us that, but we don't really get to know too much about this relationship. Here at the beginning, we run into trouble with the word it, which causes trouble because it could mean anything. And what it refers to sets the stakes of the relationship and the loss at different levels. Maybe you could say it dramatizes the speaker's unwillingness to engage with what happened head-on. Okay, but it does also keep the reader forever in the dark on some level. And as lovely as it is to hear that the speaker can't forget the time they spent together and will hold those memories dear, how awesome would it be if we got to actually see those memories, right? I mean, the goal here is to let the reader experience this cherished relationship. When we can live in those memories for even a moment, rather than just hearing that they happened, we're able to feel that loss more deeply. In other words, the emotional tone of the piece could be amplified if the piece gave us more concrete specifics, images, and details, rather than just ideas or concepts of loss. In fact, I'm reminded of a poem I read with the class last year called Miss You, Would Like to Grab That Chilled Tofu We Love. It deals with a relationship that has similarly changed in a fundamental way, but it lives in the tangible realities of that relationship, betting what kind of chilies they'll put on the tofu, ordering cold yam noodles, and more. I'll link it in the description, but it's an example of a poem that builds that sense of loss by just letting readers live in the experience of it. And that's something I think this poem gets to doing well in the encounter between the speaker and their loved one. Really, I just want to see more of it. A second thing that I think would be cool to see would be if this poem played more with its lines and form. You might notice that all of these lines end in a period or comma, one with a semicolon, but really what that means is that they're all end-stopped lines. They're lines that end when grammatical units end. And there's nothing inherently wrong with following syntax so closely, but there are opportunities to do more exciting things that we miss out on when we stick with end-stopped lines. So what happens if instead of this, we had something like this? Obviously, I made some other changes besides just line breaks, and these are changes that would of course have implications for other parts of the poem, but notice what we get here. For one, we gain momentum across lines. We don't have to stop at the end of each line, so we just keep going. We also get lines that call more attention to important content words and spend less time with grammatical words and repeated ideas. Do we really need to know that the speaker was weighed down in one line and burdened with regret and grief in another? Why not convey it all in one go in just 2 words? And maybe we need an explanation of how the metaphorical glass separates the speaker and the loved one, but maybe we could get away with less explanation. I generally find in my own work that the parts where my poems start explaining themselves are the parts that usually end up getting cut. But then, with these revisions, we also get lines here that do different things. Rather than just being grammatical structures, these lines now give us opportunities to see regretful and solitary together on a line by themselves, for example. We know solitary modifies the stare, but in a flash, it might modify the speaker as well. Or here, we get to sit for a moment in the tension of forgiveness and separating, wrestling on the same line and held apart by a semicolon. And then what a relief it is when the next line gives us dissolving glass. Which is all to say that there are some untapped possibilities in the original draft to do things with lines that could energize the poem in some pretty cool ways. So see what you can do to trim, see what you can rearrange, see how you can put the form to work to enrich the shades of meaning that this poem conveys. Really, the idea, as it probably always is just to amplify the good that this piece is already doing. You are, after all, off to a great start. The first time I saw the cherry blossom tree, my damp legs had left imprints on the leather seats of a Toyota where I was smashed underneath a flood of sticky plastic bags, warm Coca-Cola bottles, ears sweaty with sticky headphones to drown out the sound of arguing from the front seat. I fell asleep in a heat-filled haze, with the sunlight turning my eyes orange and my scalp banging against the window, and the thump-thump of the car echoing the thump-thump of my tired heart. I think this piece's greatest strength may be in its specificity. We're right there in that Toyota, living in the moment. We have visual images, tactile images, auditory ones. This piece gives it to us in such an immediate and engaging way. I'm also drawn to the tensions and contrasts in this piece. We start with cherry blossoms and immediately move into a setting that is far from the romance that we may be expecting. And even in that hot, unpleasant car, There's a peacefulness in the speaker falling asleep, orange sunlight filtering through their eyelids. But then, even then, there's the scalp banging against the window. And it can't just be me, but there's something so much more uncomfortable about a scalp banging into a window than a head banging into a window. It's kind of really upsetting, but like in the very best way. Really, it's a delightful evocation of a moment in time, and the diction is doing a lot of good work to that end. But it would be great to see this piece do just a little more directing, to help us to see why this moment matters to the speaker and why it should matter to us. The idea would be to give us just enough of the larger context to see what it is exactly that makes this moment meaningful. And that's something even a title could help with. I may have mentioned it before, but I had a teacher once who said that artists will sometimes paint something, not give it a title, and then say, "There's just no way to put it into words." Then that teacher looked at us and said, "But if you're poets, your only job is putting things into words, so you better give your stuff titles." As much as that statement stuck in my head, it's not the only reason to give a piece a title. Where our goal is usually to make a poem as compressed and efficient as possible, a title can be a great place to do some of the contextualizing, explanatory work that will help your reader to make sense of the experience your poem provides. I mean, this is a really different poem if the title is "We Moved Away on My 13th Birthday" versus "Why I Keep Cherry Blossoms in My Office." With the first, the poem would read as a reflection on being a kid and having your birthday ruined by the realities of life. Surely the speaker's parents didn't mean to ruin their birthday. It just happened, but even on that miserable cross-country drive, the speaker saw cherry blossoms for the first time, almost like a beautiful and magical gift from nature. Or with the second, maybe the speaker sees those cherry blossoms as a cheery, momentary refuge from an otherwise difficult childhood. The general unpleasantness in the poem is fairly unmistakable, and now, with their own office, they keep cherry blossoms around as a reminder that there's always some beauty and peace in the challenging moments of life. Of course, the title could also be something like, "I was supposed to send the signal at the first sight of cherry blossoms, but the enemy spies got to me first, and now it's too late." Of course, that's a silly title, and it probably doesn't help us with this poem. But because there isn't a title, there just aren't guardrails to stop me from slipping and sliding into a silly reading of the piece. I've heard many poets talk about titles as interpretive keys. Where a poem doesn't do a lot to tell us what to do with the images it presents, a title can do the work to show us how to make sense of the poem, or, just as useful, how not to make sense of it. When a piece doesn't give a reader much context, readers have to try and piece one together themselves, which means that you're going to have a lot of readers going places you didn't expect. So being more straightforward about context isn't a betrayal of the art, it's a gesture of kindness to your reader. It ensures that they can spend their energy appreciating what you have to say, instead of trying to figure it out, always looking over their shoulder and wondering whether or not they got it right. And besides that, it seems fairly clear that the larger context isn't a mystery to the speaker, and that figuring it out isn't the point of the poem. They aren't themselves performing any effort to figure this out, so I wonder why it has to be a mystery to me. Where this poem is so careful in welcoming readers into the moment, and it does it in such an engaging and delightful way, I do wish that the piece would welcome me just as much into the moment's significance, that it would do more to show where the speaker stands in relation to that car ride, so that I can fully take in the implications of all that's on offer. On wings of silk. On wings of silk she swims through summer air, twixt eddies spun round garden stems, she turns with them to dote upon her great inheritance. For all the world before is hers, and all behind her too, to take and make it what she will, yet nothing does she do, except alight upon it all, and shake to dust the world and sanctify it, true. So plain, so beige, so small and simply made, and all her kin are mirrors of the same. An interlacing tapestry is laid of frail and mortal life pursued as game. But in God's grace she's strong enough to sing, upon God's gale her tender form a wing. Hooray for a sonnet! It's fun to see formal verse, and it comes with its own unique opportunities and challenges. As always, there are some awesome things happening here, and some things to think about for revision, so let's take a look. As far as form goes, this sonnet's put together with some really good technique. We've got rock-solid iambic pentameter and a reliably Elizabethan rhyme scheme. These can be steep challenges for a writer, so it's exciting to see them working so well here. Probably more importantly, though, I like what this poem's after. The focus on a little beige moth is pleasing, and the poem's effort to celebrate something so unassuming is pretty charming. I think I'm not the only one who tends to think of moths as maybe kind of dirty, disagreeable things, so this poem's inversion of that, reframing the moth as a creature that spreads a sanctifying dust, is really cool. And whether you share the speaker's orientation to God or not, the speaker's reverence for the small and overlooked is compelling. Hold on, the poem seems to say. Don't just ignore this drab winged thing, but look at how even this little dusty bug is charged with divinity. There's a quality of attention here and a willingness to find beauty where others might not that I'm on board with. This piece has something awesome at the heart of it. And I do like that we see some glimmers of loosening the form in the first few lines, which actually leads me to some thoughts I have for revision. See, as much as I love working in set forms, they can have a nasty tendency to kind of take over. And I think we see evidence of that here, which is not a fault of the writer or of the form. It's just something to be aware of when you're writing a sonnet. So let's look at a couple of issues that the sonnet has brought us to deal with. Maybe most notable, we have some old-fashioned sounding diction. Twixt, apostrophe round, alight, and kin. It's not that these are bad words, but they are words that modern readers of poetry are probably going to be sensitive to. The sonnet is an old form, and sometimes we might feel like we need to put on our yesteryear hats in order to sound sufficiently poetic. Wordsworth famously argued that poetry should be written in the language that people really use, and that idea has stuck around. But if you read Wordsworth now, you might wonder what he was talking about. Of course, English has changed since he was writing poetry, and it's certainly changed even more since Shakespeare was doing his sonneteering. So at best, the older language will sound a little out of place. At worst, though, readers may think that you're putting on airs. And I'd like to think that most writers aren't doing that, but the risk of the perception is out there, so it would be helpful to bring the diction more in line with the 21st century. Also, many contemporary poets loosen up the form when they work in it. I wouldn't say that you have to loosen up the form, but I don't think anyone would think less of you if you did. And if it's a trade-off between keeping strict meter and being stuck with twixt, or loosening up the meter a little and going with the more common between, I think many modern readers would probably take that trade. And sometimes I think the pressures of meter lead us to put in syllables that we don't actually need. At least I know I often find myself saying what I need to say in 6 or 8 syllables, and then scrambling to find more to say in order to fill out a line of pentameter. And then on top of that, it has to rhyme. So now I'm lost in counting syllables and making sure that certain syllables land on every 10th count. It's genuinely a difficult job. But I do wonder when I read a line like, "She turns with them to dote upon her great inheritance," what that actually means. In what ways is a moth flying through the air doting on her inheritance? And is her inheritance the garden? Life as a moth on planet Earth? It all sounds very pretty and it follows the rules, but I do feel like it could be saying more than it actually does. So even if the final version of this poem remains a strict sonnet, and I'm all for it if it does, it would probably be helpful to try out a couple intermediate drafts that focus less on the form and more on making sure you've said what you really have to say. Get your meaning straight and then massage it back into form. And if you can really avoid the temptation to let the form take over the message, well, then you'll be doing better than me most of the time. But something like this might get you thinking about possible alternatives. On wings of silk, she swims through garden air and rides on eddies, bobs on summer's gusts. Though plain, she flits from stem to stem, and where she goes, she leaves her sanctifying dust. Of course, once again, you could probably do better, but what I will say is that this start has a more contemporary diction and also gets a lot of what the first 9 or so lines say in the original compressed into just 4, which then gives you a lot of room for developing these ideas in the rest of the poem. In the end, I think the connection between this moth and other moths, and then to this speaker's concept of God, is really compelling. So I offer this as a way to get the initial observations in place and out of the way, so that the poem can have more space to draw out those more meaningful resonances and connections. But with that, let's take a look at the final poem for today. Sounds of Death. I call your name a few times, your lack of response expected. Thin curtains rattle around, veiling this last medical rite. Maybe your warm body is still breathing? Alas, oxygen streaming through nasal cannulae mimics gasping all too well. My own ephemeral existence echoes against the auditory void of your chest. Solemnly, I softly convey the findings. absorbing the choking voices holding back tears. I am thanked for my help. Silence sounds different today. Well, this one will get you. What a resounding tension we get here. Not just the ultimate tension of life and death, but all the complexities of being a medical professional who certifies end of life. On some level, it's presented as routine, expecting no response, recognizing the familiar sound of nasal cannulae, but it's underscored by a refusal of that routine. The speaker calls the patients by name, mistakes the flow of oxygen for breath, and then there's the tension of the clinical, like the lines, oxygen streaming through nasal cannulae, and solemnly I softly convey the findings, that runs up against the human or even transcendent in lines like, my own ephemeral existence echoes against the auditory void of your chest, and the acknowledgement of the survivors holding back tears. It's a poem that takes on what must be the strange and ever uncanny overlap of the technical, professional, personal, and familial in hospitals at the end of life. The speaker is both somehow intimately involved and a total stranger, and this poem addresses it with equal parts reserve and a bit of confession. There are so many interesting things drawing such a compelling human complexity out of this moment, and it's happening all at once. With such a sense of direction, our primary job in revision should probably be to make sure that this poem isn't getting in its own way, to pare it down and streamline it so that formally it's living up to what it's doing in terms of its content. And to that end, there are a couple small things that I think could make a really big difference. Number one, like we talked about earlier, these lines could probably be doing some more interesting things than they are currently. These lines are generally broken in grammatical places, which again, it's not wrong, but it does mean that you probably won't surprise your readers with any of them. Also, generally speaking, the ends of lines are places that carry a lot of emphasis. They're where readers stop even in passing before going on to the next one. Because of that, you'll generally want to make sure that your most interesting and meaningful words end up at the ends of lines. So, for example, where we have lines here ending in prepositions, we end up with fairly uninteresting words in really important spots. In addition to taking another look at how the lines are broken up and where they break, I think this poem is making some syntactical choices in its current form that are maybe more trouble than they're worth, especially the use of passive voice at the beginning and end of the piece. And I can see an argument for using passive voice as an element of the clinical flavor in this poem, but I'll make my case for why it might not need to stay in a final draft. For one, while this poem does have a clinical element to it, and it does take place in a clinical setting, I don't think that's really at the heart of this piece. The personal grappling with mortality and the interaction with the family on a human level seem much more important, and the passive voice serves to distance us from that humanity in what feels like a counterproductive way. Also, people like to complain about the passive voice in general, so when you think that the passive voice fussy patrol might be doing its rounds, it's always worth interrogating your use of the passive voice, at least at first. But more importantly, passive voice does a couple of undesirable things, regardless of what overly sensitive English majors who learned never to use it might say. Because it inverts typical English syntax, turning objects into subjects, it can create some clarity issues. And that also creates emphasis issues because passive voice puts the focus on the object of the verb rather than the one doing it. To use the example that everyone always seems to use, passive voice tells us to put our attention on the ball rather than on Johnny who's kicking it. And usually it's more interesting to put our attention on the ones taking action than on the objects receiving those actions. And here, the cumulative effect of these elements of the passive voice seems to detach the speaker from the moment. It kind of intellectualizes aspects of something that is otherwise so grounded and human. So consider what would happen if we reorganize the lines and switch the passive to active. In that case, the poem might begin something like this. Here we get the speaker calling out, and their expecting is syntactically aligned with the agent now. But we also get lines that do some interesting things. The through line of the sentence is, I call your name, expecting no response. But the line break puts us in this quantum superposition of possibilities. There's the literal meaning of the sentence, but the break gives us a first line that resonates with the speaker's faded optimism. I call your name, expecting. For just a moment, we also expect, maybe hope for something, and then we crash into that terse second line, no response. The line break works against the structure of the sentence and adds to the sense of tension and conflict in this poem, the push and pull of hoping for life, but also moving through the realities of death. And we don't get that when the second line just states the clinical fact, your lack of response expected. And we could do something similar at the end as well. The switch to active voice for that last line can work to intensify the sense of self-implication and strangeness of the poem's final gesture. It seems to be a moment where politeness and social scripts override human reality. We see people holding back their grief in the immediate aftermath of losing a loved one in order to thank the worker delivering the news, and isn't that kind of strange? The poem is pointing us directly at the weirdness of situating something as momentous and personal as death in such a systematized and routine context. Wouldn't the correct thing to do, the only thing really, be to grieve? But no, the bereaved offer the customary gratitude to the physician before grieving, and I can't help but read the speaker's discomfort with that fact here. And that all gets muted with passive voice, which pulls attention away from the agents and on to the object of the action. It's not just anyone who thanks the speaker, as we could understand the passive voice to be saying. It's the surviving family members, and the active voice in paired back lines would force us to reckon more directly with that moving reality. I also zapped the last line, mostly because ending on the self-implicating thanks is such a compelling gesture, and because silence sounds different today doesn't really tell us that much. It sounds different, but how? Actually, that kind of open gesture of the last line could make it a pretty interesting title. What if we get the assertion right away that silence sounds different, and then the poem works as an explanation of how and why? Sometimes we manage to end up right where we should have started. And speaking of ending where we should have started, I just want to say thanks again, especially to these 4 poets, but also to all of you who have been sending in your work. This was a really fun video to put together, and I hope you find it helpful too. Now, I picked today's poems because they gave us a good variety of different things to talk about. All of them were good, none of them were perfect, and for our purposes, they all gave us a great chance to talk about some of the practical stuff that goes into writing and revising poetry. And to be clear one last time, the goal here is not to rewrite your poems or tell you what you have to do. They're your poems, and it's your creative vision. But as much as I could glimpse your vision through what you submitted, I do think these recommendations represent the kinds of things you might consider that will help your poems to live up to the visions you have for them. And of course, you could very likely find readers who would give very different suggestions. And if that's the case, well, welcome to the writing life, my friends. It's all information, and it's always up to you what you do with that information in order to realize your artistic goals. But we've already done a whole show on navigating conflicting feedback, so you might check that out next if you're wondering what to do when that happens. Of course, we could say plenty more about each of these pieces, but as a poet, my attention span can only hold on to so much at once, and we've been generously gifted with some cool creative work already in this one. So we must end at some point, but I'll finish by inviting you one more time to send in your work. Or if you'd like guaranteed, in-depth, individualized feedback on your writing, whether it's poetry or not, be sure to check out the link in the description, and I'll be happy to work with you. Whatever you do, though, I can't thank you enough for watching. I really don't think I could overstate what a meaningful support to the show it is that you just show up and watch. So to all of you who are still with me here at the end, thank you. And I'm already looking forward to sharing some exciting writing goodness with you in the next one.